living the dream. I am an academic who is living in the city she grew up in. So I'm from Pittsburgh, and I grew up in the neighborhood of Squirrel Hill, which is a really tightly knit community in the city of Pittsburgh. And I have the pleasure of raising my 4 children in the same neighborhood that I grew up in. So, as a child, I loved everything about my neighborhood. I loved all the gossip, I loved all of the neighbors, and I loved living in a place where I felt so connected to other people. And this has actually really driven so much of my research, that I study communities, and it's been just a dream of a lifetime to be able to live in the community that I grew up in and study communities in this beautiful place. My parents always just said, work hard. We don't care what your grades are, we just care that you work hard. And I learned how to read from my grandmother. My grandmother was blind, and she lived with us growing up, and she would make me read the newspaper to her every day. And I got very interested in world affairs and soap operas by reading the newspaper with her and then telling her what was going on in her favorite soap operas. But it was actually this reading the news that got me really interested in world affairs. And when I was in high school, in my public high school in Pittsburgh, they offered Russian language. And it was during the height of perestroika and glasnost, and there was so much going on, and I started studying Russian, and it really changed my life. I think it was an old Cold War hangover, and it was really amazing during that period of time. My teacher, she was not Russian, she was not a native speaker, and we had a huge influx, this was in the early 90s, of refuseniks. These were Jewish immigrants who came from the former Soviet Union, and there were tons of them in our high school, and I tutored them. I taught them English, they helped me with my Russian, and I really then actually developed a love for teaching. So as anybody who's really curious about world affairs, conflict is everywhere. And as I graduated from college and went off into the world, I joined the Peace Corps. And I ended up in Central Asia and Uzbekistan, and that was because I spoke Russian. It's a country in the former Soviet Union, and the Peace Corps said, okay, you speak Russian now. And so I went off to Uzbekistan, and I lived in this really tightly knit community in the city of Samarkand, which is the second largest city in Uzbekistan. And living in this community, I saw it was a very authoritarian state. I saw the incredible ways that people work together to overcome difference, to solve problems, things they couldn't take to the state. I saw how community activities sort of dissimulated underground because of authoritarianism. So I eventually went back to graduate school, and as a political scientist, most of the ideas were focused on big picture things like constitutions and reforms post-communism and macroeconomic reforms and democratization. And I never felt like most of those approaches captured the really unique things, the theoretical approaches that I found so exciting to me. And it wasn't until my second or third year in graduate school where I found the work of Elinor Ostrom, who works a lot on communities and how communities solve problems. And when I found her work, she was actually the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And she said, people are not trapped in cycles of conflict. If you look at the local level, you can see a lot of beauty in the ways that people cooperate. And I was hooked. And this is something that I've been working on for such a long time, because I really see the beauty of people, the beauty of people's abilities, their creativity, and their desire to solve problems together. I ended up spending 5 years in Uzbekistan. I did 2 years in the Peace Corps, and then when I was leaving, I got a job with the U.S. Agency for International Development. And in that job, I was doing democracy assistance. I was promoting democracy and working with government officials in one of the world's most authoritarian states, especially at that time. It was up there with North Korea and Syria, really at the bottom of the barrel. And it was hard work, and it was really discouraging and dispiriting, because I ended up spending so much of my time getting human rights activists out of the country. It wasn't really developing a democracy. And when I went back to graduate school, most of the theories, especially about the post-Soviet space, this was really right after 9/11, were focused on democratization, that there was this belief, that the end of history was upon us and all of these countries would transition to market democracies. And so so many of these academic theories focused, especially in political science, focused on these, national level institutions. They focused on, what I could find was, designing electoral institutions to help people avoid conflict. And I never really felt comfortable at this really, macro scale. I was really interested at the micro scale. And then I met a bunch of professors who were doing international relations, and they said, you have this aid background. You can talk about how aid projects at the local level really help people. And at first I thought that was really exciting, and I sort of ran in that direction. But what I realized is that, unfortunately from my experience, I didn't find this international aid to be terribly effective. And then I was studying it, and I felt like by studying it, I was actually reifying something. I was making something more important than it was. And what I realized, it wasn't actually until I did a master's degree in agricultural economics at the University of Wisconsin that I came upon Ostrom and these theories that were really on bottom-up cooperation. And it was in economics I found these ideas to be much more relevant than they were in political science. Sure, so I can illustrate that from a couple of, real experiences I had doing this work, actually, as a policy person. I remember there was a lot of ethnic conflict in certain parts of Central Asia in a place called the Fergana Valley. It's actually a third of the population in Central Asia lives in this very, very small valley in kind of the heart of Central Asia. It's in Central Asia. It astrides Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And Stalin drew the boundaries such that, you have ethnic groups of all types on all sides of these boundaries. They don't make sense. So, during the Soviet period, these were not international boundaries. So, you have a lot of Uzbeks living in what is now Kyrgyzstan. You have a lot of Tajiks living in what is now Uzbekistan. You have a lot of Uzbeks living in what is now Tajikistan. And during the Soviet period, this didn't make a lot of, it didn't matter that much because you could travel freely between these places. But when independence happened, these boundaries were drawn and families were then split up. Really rigid boundaries that they couldn't, and these were all authoritarian states in the very beginning, and so, really strict visa controls, and then you begin to see a lot of ethnic conflict, fighting, riots, pogroms of different groups. And so here comes international aid to the rescue. So I was part of designing a project that was intended to help ethnic minorities on all sides of these boundaries. And I remember going to one village, and it was in Kyrgyzstan, where our aid projects had given resources to the Uzbek minority group. And the Uzbeks said, we've never had natural gas in our village. We never had lines that came to our village, and it's so grateful for this project. Now we have natural gas. And I said, has anybody gone to the Kyrgyz village next door to see if they have gas? And it just didn't dawn on anybody. They were just targeting the minority group. So I go over to the Kyrgyz community, and lo and behold, they didn't have gas either. And so what was made to be an issue of ethnic discrimination actually wasn't. And I felt like in this case, our aid projects actually helped create division rather than smooth them over or solve these problems or bring people together. You were just targeting people because they were members of a certain group. I'll also never forget going to a community center in Uzbekistan. And we had a grants program that went to communities, and to have communities sort of identify their own projects, come together and solve them, and the grant money would go to the thing that the community had identified as a big problem. So I meet this community leader, and he has a computer and he has a modem, and he says, look, thanks to the people of the United States, I have this great modem, and I've collected all of this data about all of the people in the village, and I'm uploading it to the Ministry of Interior. And I can see who's been naughty and who's been nice, who's been drinking too much, who's engaging in, bad behavior. And isn't this wonderful? And my jaw dropped, right? I couldn't believe what I saw. So this led me to be pretty skeptical of how we take big ideas, well-intentioned efforts, and translate them into things that are really meaningful and contribute positively to people's lives.